Okay, we'll go find that PowerPoint and off we will go. So I'm going to start with container gardening. If I hit the right buttons in the right order here.
Hey, Tessa, I just wanted to compliment you on your photos of your flowers. So good job.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
I had to print them on my color printer.
Yeah, all those pretty colors, huh?
Yep. So thank you.
You're welcome. We need a little bright colors, and actually it was a beautiful day out there today. That was a good day for working outside.
Yes, it was.
Okay, so let's talk about container gardening. We spent all this time talking about our soils and kind of dealing with what we have, and there's a great opportunity with containers if you want to get flowers up closer to your house. If you're living in an area where containers is about the only option that's going to work for you, or even like at my office where there's not a huge area to do gardening, we can put a lot in containers. So we'll talk about some design principles, some flowers that like to live in containers, how to do season-long designs, what kind of soils to pick, all that good stuff. So why container gardening? And I wish I've created a container like the one in the picture. That's obviously not one of mine, but I aspire to do something like that. I tend to have just one flower at a time in a container, and I feel like I'm doing pretty good there. But container gardening may be limited time and space. So limited time, I know sometimes my couple of acres overwhelms me. So with the time I have, probably a couple containers would be a better choice. You might have poor soil that you haven't got amended and ready to grow in yet. It's a little easier to do weed control in containers. The first couple years are generally weed-free, but no weed seeds will blow into containers too. So if you're not switching out your potting soil all the time, you may still be controlling weeds up in your containers. I think it's very creative. You have such a small space, and your container is part of the whole picture. So just a lot of opportunities there. Plus creative, generally you're not putting perennials in containers, so you're doing annuals, so you get to change it up all the time. Accessibility. I always complain, especially after a day like today, is why does gardening all have to be on the ground? You know, the leaning over, or if it's a year that you've had a surgery or you've got a back issue, sometimes containers are the place to go. And they're great for beginning and advanced gardeners. If you put a single plant in a simple container with drainage, it'll probably do just fine. And the advanced gardeners can figure out how to put 6 or 7 different plants in there and manage all their different needs at the same time. So choosing a container. Basically, anything that holds soil and has drainage holes can be a plant container. Unfortunately, a lot of the times when you buy a plant container at the store, it does not have drainage holes. So sometimes they've made areas for drainage holes where you can take a sharp knife or a drill bit and be able to create some holes. But that's probably the number one challenge with containers, is not having adequate drainage. So you really need to be sure it has drainage holes. And even myself, I've gotten like a big whiskey barrel before and then had half my soil in there and went, oh, it's such a big container, I'll never overwater it, it'll be okay. And the one time I did that, I loaned out that container for Adams County Fair, which is the week before ours, and it got put under a air conditioning thing, and that thing dripped water and floated all the plants up and out of the container because it didn't have drainage holes. So now, always, and I should have known better, make sure it has drainage holes. Material choices. I think terracotta is probably the most traditional choice for a container. They tend to whiten up a little bit with our hard water. So year after year, they're not as attractive. They are a good insulating material, but they are porous. And so sometimes they can dry out a little bit faster than, say, a plastic container. They now make amazing plastic containers that look like they're made out of a concrete or pottery, and they're a lot easier to move around. With our soil temperatures, we've got to be very careful that we're not overheating plants in the summer. So black plastic sometimes can be a little hard on plant roots. And then again, in the winter, if we are trying to grow something that's perennial, it can be very hard to keep it in a container. Generally, you'll want to move it into a more protected area and maybe even put some mulch or insulation around it. If you even leaving the pots out for winter, if the soil has enough water in there and freezes, you can actually crack your terracotta or your ceramic pots. So taking good care of those, because they can be expensive, especially for good sizes. It's been very popular to do different sizes. So now we get, the whiskey barrel size and larger, but now they've got all these cute little miniature gardens. Usually those are done with succulents, but every size imaginable. And I kind of like what they have on my picture here on the right-hand side is using containers that match, but of all different sizes to hold all sorts of different plants. So then you can manage each one of those plants' needs. It looks like that's an herb garden. And each of those is going to need a little bit different water and maybe even different soils, but it kind of makes a cohesive design since they all have the same container. One thing is the material going to rot over time. If you build with standard lumber that's not pre-treated, then over time that container may start to fall apart. We're pretty lucky in our dry climate that process usually goes a little slower. You can get quite a few years out of a container, but something you need to look at over time. And how much will it cost? Some of those big containers are up into the hundreds of dollars, and so you really have to decide, kind of limit your flexibility. When you spend $100 for a container, you're probably going to use that year after year. So choose it in a neutral color or something you can change with as your mind changes about what plants you like. So here's some fun container options. Actually, the boots look great, but we need all mismatched boots because it's usually the one that has gotten lost or the dog has drug away, and you've always got one spare. I'm guessing they have drilled drainage holes in the bottom of that just with a drill, but I think that's kind of a cute thing. Just have marigolds growing in there. We have the old wagon, and it's got succulents in it. And that could be kind of hard. You might have to drill holes in that old wagon and might not be willing to do that, but it'd be hard to grow without those drainage holes. My favorite container, maybe not for decorative purposes, but for growing purposes, is that fabric pot that you see on the right. And we've talked a little bit about that in class, but you can't overwater it because the water just runs out the sides. And since it's not plastic and it's fabric, it doesn't really overheat. And the company says it actually air prunes the roots. So roots want to stay in the soil, so they will actually stay back from the fabric a little bit and use up that whole space. And I've had really good luck. It's, I think, a 5-gallon fabric pot, and I've grown full-size heirloom tomatoes in them without a challenge at all. Tires were popular in the last bit. I just saw your hand raised, Katie. I'll get you here in a second. Do you have your microphone, or are you going to do chat, Katie?
Oh, there it is. Sorry. I was just curious in those fabric pots, how long they last.
So I have some that have lasted several seasons, but if I leave them with soil outside, they become rodent homes. So they will dig holes up through the bottom into the. So you just have to, if you dump them out and pick them up every year, they don't seem to break down with the sun at all. I think you'd get lots of years out of them, but if you leave them on the ground, things tend to burrow up in them and live in them. So.
Hey, Tessa?
Yes.
This is Jan. I had a lady that started raising her garden produce like radishes and stuff like that in her racing slicks. And so I told her to take them out of there. They're only good for flowers and stuff, not edibles.
Yeah, and I'd probably be hesitant to grow edibles in tires just because they're not meant originally for planting. One thing you could do, like these are painted, if they had a thick coat of epoxy paint on them, inside and outside, that might be enough to make me comfortable with being in there. But exposed to that rubber surface, and especially if it's been around oil and grease, yeah, you probably don't want to do edibles in those containers.
Yeah, it's sort of similar to the railroad ties.
Yeah, just got to be a little careful. Yep.
Yeah, we did some research, and they said they use a different type of fuel for the cars with racing slicks than normal tires. So I just told her not to use the racing slicks anymore.
Yeah, creative idea, but I think for food, I would be the same. That just sounds a little dangerous. And then, yeah, the fuel and oil you'd pick up on those at the track. Probably don't want to be eating that stuff.
Okay.
Thanks for sharing, Jan.
You bet.
And then in the corner there, a very kind of cute antique colander, but talk about built-in drainage. I never thought of a colander till I saw this picture, but that's all ready to go for planting. So yeah, you can be creative about what you have around the house. Some people, you got that old toilet and you want to do something with it. So I have seen toilets in front yard landscapes with flowers in them. So everyone has their own idea of pretty, I guess. Soil mixes to use in your containers. You never want to just take big shovelfuls out of your garden and plop it up into a container. So we did lots of talking about the structure of soil. And when you dig it up and put it in a container, it automatically becomes compacted and it's a little too stiff to use for garden soil. You'll have a huge problem with drainage. And a lot of our annual plants like petunias, and those are really picky about having fast drainage, and that garden soil will get them. You also have the chance to introduce some diseases. Remember, for diseases, you need the disease organism, which generally could be in your garden soil, especially for root rot diseases. And then without that good drainage of a normal soil, things are going to get a little wet. So I suggest for your containers using soil mixes or soilless mixes and potting soil. Now you can put a little bit of garden soil in there if you want to, but then again, you're kind of introducing maybe a disease organism that might give you trouble later on. If your container is huge, sometimes filling it with something else before. So one thing that I've used is just upside down planting pots, the plastic planting pot. I put those in the bottom of my whiskey barrel just to take up some room, so it doesn't take me 6 bags of potting soil to fill that thing up. And that just, with them flipped over, they're still allowing drainage. It just takes up some of that volume. I've seen people use milk cartons or milk jugs to try to take up some of that room. So if you have a giant container, I know it gets really expensive to buy the potting soil. So that's some ideas to help you out. You want to be sure your soil has proper drainage and aeration, very important in a pot. So generally it'll be a peat moss or a core fiber base, and then either vermiculite or perlite in it. So remember, perlite's kind of the white styrofoam type stuff. And it sometimes floats to the top, and I'm not 100% sold on perlite, but it's in most potting mixes. And then the vermiculite was kind of the shiny stuff that I think I brought a sample that very first week to show you guys. So that just gives it even more fluffiness. Usually most potting mixes has some sort of forest product in them, like a chip or a bark. And then some will have nutrients. So like your Miracle-Gro potting mix has a little bit of nutrients in it. And we'll talk a little later about fertilizing your container, but these soil mixes are not going to have a ton of fertilizer in them. And most things you're growing in a container have pretty high fertilizer needs because they're usually a flowering plant, usually an annual that you really want to produce well. These soil mixes can be kind of expensive, especially if you've got a whole series of large pots that you're redoing every year. So I tend to use this as kind of a soil amendment. I grow in a year in that potting soil, and then I dump that potting soil out, and it becomes an amendment in my raised beds. And so that makes me feel like I'm not wasting as much money, or that potting soil is having a better purpose. If you really need to, you can actually only trade out a half or a third each year to kind of save you. But you are going to suffer some drainage issues eventually. That potting mix kind of breaks down and it loses structure and starts to cause issues. So best off to buy large things of potting soil. We talked about that places like Steve Regan and Caldwell can sell potting soil by the bale. Usually you only find peat moss by the bale at your Home Depots and Bi-Marts. So that can be a more affordable way to fill lots of pots. So if you know you're going to have a huge potting soil need, sometimes buying it kind of on that almost commercial level as a bale of potting mix can save you a little money. So consider the environment that you have to grow these plants. So what is your light like? Are you going to need shade plants or sun plants or something in between? What's the temperature of that area going to be? So if you're growing hanging baskets on a full sun front porch up in the wind, that's a pretty rough environment to live in. So, mine usually start out as the top basket, and then the bottom basket is what happens when I get busy in the summer and the drip irrigation isn't turned on. So it's amazing how quickly you can go from the top picture to the bottom picture. So that's the hanging basket is a rough environment to live in, and automatic irrigation and maybe even a shadier spot, or at least a spot that gets afternoon shade, might be a better choice if you have a choice of where to put those baskets. You also want to look at heat absorption. So if you're growing on concrete next to a brick or concrete building, you're really going to have a lot of heat buildup. We have that issue at the Vendome. So they have containers out front. They're fairly deep, but they're fairly shallow. I think they're only about 18 inches, 2 feet wide. And they are concrete containers with a brick wall behind them and sidewalk in front of them, and then on the south side of the building. So I have to be really careful to put hardy plants in there, full sun plants, and then really check the irrigation, because if the irrigation, last year we had a little screw up, and I think it was off for a week, and the plants really started to decline fast. So really looking at that environment that you're going to have that pot in. You're lucky you're up in a container. You've got some things you can, maybe scoot it around the house if you've gotten into the wrong place. Once you stick a perennial down in your flower garden, it's usually there for the season. But luckily with containers, maybe if you notice something wrong, you can scooch them to another spot. So here's some of my favorite ones, or just some ideas that work well and grow. So celosia, that's on the top right. It actually comes in a lot of forms. This is kind of more of a feather or a flame type form. It also has kind of the brain looking forms, if you've not seen that, or what else do they compare them to? Like to a rooster's crest. So these are very full sun, very hardy. I grew those, actually I grew these with peppers in the front of my office and in my containers, and they were really quite attractive. Lantana. So lantana has the little tiny flowers. That's that blue, red, pink, and white one that you kind of see there. It's a very common one to find at nurseries. They actually have some bicolored ones now, like the center flowers will be like a pink and the outer flowers will be more orange. Some really pretty combinations. Petunias are probably your traditional one. I didn't add a picture of those because I'm pretty sure most people know what a petunia is. They've got lots of fun trailing and tidal wave varieties that really spread out and fill in. Calabrocha is the name of the things that look just like a petunia, but they're little. So calabrochas have become very popular in lots of different colors. And I've got a picture of that. That's what the pink is in the little pink flower. I guess I've got a couple little pink flowers. Little pink flower to the right. Moss rose. Moss roses do really well. I bought these. The Weiser FFA usually sells moss roses, and I usually pick some of those up. And their leaves look a little bit succulent, and then they produce flowers all season. Verbena. I don't have a picture of verbena, but it's another nice, usually purple blue one. And then zinnias. Zinnias do really well in full sun in a container. They make some. You get some really big zinnias for your garden, but they make some miniature ones that do well in containers. So need some shade. So coleus, I really like coleus, and I don't often have shade to grow in, but I love all the different colors and textures of the leaves. So that's on the right-hand side. And those, you actually are growing them for the leaves, and you probably want to pinch off their little flower heads. Their flowers are kind of insignificant little white things. And once they flower, they're an annual, and they'll kind of start to go downhill once they think they're done with their lives. So if you keep pinching off the little flowers, it keeps it going. And that's actually a good advice for all of these annuals, is to deadhead them regularly. Most of them are annuals. They're trying to complete their life cycle, and you want to say, no, go ahead and keep growing. Let me make you try again. Pick off all the seed heads. Impatiens, that's on the bottom right there. They're a very attractive flower. They can have a little bit of trouble with powdery mildew and other diseases, but once again, we're not in a huge disease area, so they do okay. Lobelia would be on the top left there, the little blue flowers. Kind of a stunning little blue. They're one of my favorites. I am missing the fuchsia picture, but fuchsia have kind of a lily orchid-like bloom. They're pretty touchy about full sun or amount of sun in the water. I've never been able to keep one of them alive, but I hope to someday. That shade really helps. And then begonias on the bottom left there. And begonias actually can be grown as a house plant as well. So we have a couple of begonias in our office, and we try to take them outside and let them have a little bit of summertime in the shade and then bring them back in. So that's one thing, is to look around your house and see what house plants you have that might be okay with it being in a container outside for the summer. So not only flowers, you can also do vegetables in containers. And they've made lots of miniaturized varieties that are supposed to fit into a container nicely. So they have a whole series of little patio tomatoes, and they're actually usually fairly productive. And you're usually looking at little cherry or salad-sized tomatoes off of those. Some people think, oh, I will just stick this cherry tomato in a container because it makes little tiny tomatoes. But anyone that's grown a cherry tomato know that that's a full-size plant, if not full-size and larger than the big tomato plants. I have had some cherry tomato plants get 12 feet tall. So the patio tomatoes might be a better choice than a traditional cherry tomato, because the tomatoes are small, but the plant is not. They have some miniature peppers, some miniature eggplants. Of course, lettuce and spinach grows well in containers, and sometimes you can find that shade to keep them from bolting if you grow them in a container as well. Most of your herbs are fairly happy in a container. In fact, if you have something in the mint family, I suggest only growing it in a container so it doesn't sneak out and rule the world. And they make some cute little bush cucumbers that you're going to want probably a 3 to 5 gallon container to do a cucumber in, but they would be happy in that. So here's some example of vegetables in containers. So off to that left-hand side, you see they have all sorts of different containers, and looks like they're growing peas and some onions. Now I'm getting a message that my internet connection is unstable, so hopefully I can keep the boys off and things will hold together here, but let me know if I end up pausing. I'm guessing that background might be potatoes. It's kind of hard to tell. And some little lettuces in the front row there. So some kind of fun things to grow in a container. On the right, you have 5 stalks of corn. And that one's actually there as kind of a cautionary tale. Corn is wind pollinated, and you usually need to grow it in a pretty good block to have it pollinate correctly. So I'd be a little concerned with just 5 plants. And of course, they show they have ears on them, so everything must have worked out for them. There's an example of that patio tomato. As I said, it's produces quite a few tomatoes without too much plant, and so that might be a good variety if you're growing in greenhouse space or even a smaller space to get good production in a small area. And then that bottom right is just an example of a little patio bush cucumber taken off. So choosing plants for the annual flowers, and kind of the design method that's usually taught, is you need a thriller, a filler, and a spiller. So your thriller is your tall plant in the center. So one of these has a grass, looks like a purple type grass in the middle. You've got looks like maybe a caladium on these other 2 that they've grown in the middle, which is actually grown from like a root or a corm. Then you have the filler, which is your round mounding plant. So here they've used petunias and calabrotia, maybe some coleus in there. and then a spiller that kind of hangs over the side. So a lot of your petunias and calabroccia, when they get a little bit bigger, will do that droop over the side that's fairly attractive. So most times when you're learning container design, this is kind of the method they use. You need some of that height in the container and then something to spill over the edges. So planting ideas online. I actually found some good sites that'll give you lots of ideas. So Proven Winners is a common plant company name that you see in local garden stores. So it's kind of nice if you find this design, but you can also find the plants. So that's provenwinners.com/container gardening. And that right is a kind of an example of what they have. So they show you the plants. It looks like they have a lamium, a dead nettle, a salvia, and a sweet alyssum. And then they're wanting you to buy one of the salvia and 2 of each of the other plants, and then kind of shows you what it looks like when you put that all together. Fine Gardening Container Design Challenge was one of my favorites and really creative designs in that. So Fine Gardening is a common magazine for gardeners, and they each year do a design challenge. And so if you're looking for something outside of the thriller, filler, spiller designs, that gives you some more creative opportunities.
Tessa, can I add one to that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Laura at Andrew Seed does a YouTube presentation on all kinds of things. It's called thegardenanswer.com.
Yeah, thanks for reminding me, Jan. So that's Laura from Andrew Seed actually has a nationwide YouTube channel. So she's on gardenanswer.com. You can find those, and also Garden Answer, if you search that on Facebook or Instagram. I believe she has both of those through social media as well. And she specializes in succulents and fairy gardens and some of these really specialized, really cool ones. So very good. Okay, another is watering a container. And containers can be kind of a challenge a little bit to tell how much water you're getting into them. So you need to feel the soil. The best way is to either lift the pot a little bit and see its weight compared to what your expectation is of how wet. A really light pot's going to be too dry. And then if you've overwatered, you can usually tell. You try to pick it up and you're like, oh, that's a heavy pot. Sticking your finger in the soil is probably the best method. If the top inch is dry, then it's time to water. So you actually want to let it dry out just a little bit, just not too much. And you have to be really careful with those potting soils that are mostly peat moss, because peat moss, once it's all the way dry, is kind of hard to re-wet. So you'll pour water in there and it'll kind of just run off the top. So you really have to, soak from the bottom or slowly soak in from the top to get that peat moss re-wetted. So it's best if you can kind of keep it wet. Depending on container location and type, like hanging baskets, frequent watering. So sometimes morning and night, maybe in a drink at lunch hour too for some of those smaller containers with a light soil in them. So that's where a drip irrigation system and a timer works really well if you're forced to go to a job. Self-watering containers can work fairly well. There's kind of a design off to the right here that they're using for vegetable garden, just basically kind of 2 5-gallon buckets with a pipe in it. And you can find all sorts of creative designs for making your own. You can also just buy them. So the self-watering container, you do want to be a little careful if you're using a lot of fertilizer, because the self-watering container never all the way drains out, and you can get fertilized built up in there, and then when you water it, it comes back up into the plant, and you can actually get some fertilizer burn. And I see that a lot of the times in house plants that have trays underneath them, but it can also happen in your outside plants. And if you're getting to that stage, or you're noticing, usually it's on the margins of the leaves, you can see some fertilizer burned, usually yellow or brown. You can put it in the sink or put it on the sidewalk and just let the water drain through it and kind of drain out some of those fertilizer salts. Overly dry, putting it in a tub of water. And also with that peat moss, when it gets really dry, sometimes lukewarm water will go into the peat moss a little easier than cold water will if you've gone too long and reached that permanent wilting point on your plant. Fertilization, so you're watering really frequently and you didn't have much nutrients in your soil to begin with, so fertilization is pretty important if you're doing a container plant. Probably you want to balance both types of fertilizer. I like to stir some of the Osmocote or time-release fertilizer in with my potting mix, especially if I haven't, got something like Miracle-Gro that has a little bit in it. And then liquid would be like a Miracle-Gro or a liquid fertilizer. They make lots of different brands, some of them much better than Miracle-Gro. Andrews Seed, once again, a good place to shop for some of those options. But you want to be sure you're fertilizing those. Most of these, unless you're growing vegetables, are a flowering plant. You want to be a little careful not to over nitrogen your tomatoes, because even up in a container, they will produce beautiful plants and no tomatoes. And that higher phosphorus number, that second number, is really important for blooming plants. And it says a lot of these containers are going to be flower gardens, so be sure you're giving them adequate phosphorus. So grooming, how to keep your plants looking nice. So pinching is a common technique to keep your plants from getting leggy. So leggy is the term that's used for when you get a big long branch without a lot of leaves and then just a few little flowers at the end. We kind of like a more compact design is what we're going for, so you don't have all these stems that are hanging out of the side. So you actually want to come back to a growing point where and I'm trying to show you in the picture, there's like 2 leaves and then the middle is the stem, and you can see right in between the stem and the stem of the leaf, it's just that little tiny leaf right there. If you pinch right there, it'll grow 2 more stems and a leaf. So that's how you go from 1 stem to 2 stems and get a much more compact and bushy plant. So you'll want to just go through, and usually I just use my thumb and forefinger and a little bit of fingernail. And most of these annual plants, that just pops right off. So you want to deadhead, and I kind of use the same thing, just my fingers to kind of pluck and go through deadheading a flower. So that's just after a flower has bloomed, the bloom will die back and it's going to go into seed production. Generally, we don't want these to produce seed, so you can just come through and take those flowers off. If you end up with dead or diseased leaves, your best bet is just to pluck those off as well. Sometimes the ones that are sitting underneath next to the soil can get kind of ratty and ugly. And then being a container, this usually has a prominent place in your garden. You might need to go ahead and replace plants. So especially as the season goes along. So let's say you had little violets in there or little pansies in there in the spring. Well, by July, those pansies just aren't going to be there or looking nicely. So it's probably time to pull them out and put something in probably a petunia or something of that same stature and flower size into that spot. So to provide interest all season long, you will need to replant. Even in the annual plants, there's just not anything that's going to go from March to November. We've got our warm season annuals and our cool season annuals, and it's tough to find something that wants to do the full season. So speaking of Andrews Seed, they have containers down through the city of Ontario, down in the old part of town. And I think they're in there 3 times a year. They come in and change up. So they actually have stuck a tree in the middle of each one of those, what do you call it? Kind of a pruned, fancy little spiral tree. This has a little cypress type tree, the picture does here, in the center of each. And so that kind of fills the pot a little bit. So then they're decorating that other space, the outside space, changing those out 2 or 3 times a year. So for in spring, the primroses, in fact, my secretary has a primrose on her desk right now. They come out this time of year, and they have beautiful kind of almost fake looking flowers. They're such a vivid color, but they don't last much past June. So they're not a warm season plant. Your little violas, your pansies, your snapdragons. Sometimes your snapdragons can be convinced to make it into summer and fall. And sometimes your pansies will actually kind of die back, and if you leave them in the container, they'll make a reappearance in the fall when it cools back down. Summer, you've got your cannas, your caladiums, zinnias, celosia, dahlias, gladiolas will actually, you can do some bulbs up in containers, even some of your smaller lilies don't mind living in a container. In fall, you've got mums, ornamental kales, and ornamental cabbages, and they actually do really well, and they will stay until late November, early December usually. They're kind of a cold crop in the vegetable garden, but the ornamental ones last a long time. Once again, pansies back in the fall, and snapdragons are coming back around. And then winter, vinca vine, ivy, holly, boxwood, some of your smaller conifers. And I see a lot of people take branches and stems and some, non-flowers or non-vegetation just to kind of fill up those containers. So obviously I've given this presentation before. You all know who I am and where to contact me. But this is a presentation I've given to several different garden clubs. Okay, so we're going to switch over to cut flowers now. I figured these presentations are both kind of short and they kind of go together. And I can't get my mouse on my computer to work to be able to click the stop share button. That's an interesting. There we go.
Can I interject something here?
Yes, go ahead.
When you make your hanging baskets and you're doing them yourself, what I do is I line, you have the core outside lining.
Yes.
I take a puppy wee-wee pad and I put it in the center and I cut it and leave a little edge that I can tuck back under. And I make holes in it, and then I put my potting soil in it. Put my plants in, because it retains the water and they don't dry out as fast.
I love that. Keep the puppy from pottying on the floor and keep from having to water your plants all the time. That's
right, and then it works. And then in the fall, when you're ready to dispose of the plant, you take it to your compost pile, just empty it, and you have a nice clean basket, and you just take the puppy liner and throw it in the trash.
I like that. That's a creative dye. And I've tried out, they actually sell like the water crystals that are in diapers and in puppy pads. And they work as long as you're keeping things wet. So it'll keep things wet a little longer, but if your plants start to dry out, those crystals are actually more attracted to the water than your plant can get a hold of. But I kind of like having it in a pad in the bottom. That would kind of, give them their own little area.
Yeah, I just line the whole basket, and then you don't have to water 3 times a day, only once.
And that sure helps. Awesome.
Thanks, Tessa.
You're welcome. Yeah, so I have a message here that sometimes my words will be choppy or the audio will be bad. That's due to my home internet. So I've only gotten one warning that I've had bad internet connection, but let me know if that continues, because I can go yell at the kids and make sure they're not sneaking on to just one short little video, Mom, while you're online. So living out in the country is kind of a challenge when it comes to keeping the internet going. Okay, we're going to switch over to, if I make my mouse work, switch over to the next PowerPoint on cut flowers. There we go. Okay, now if I can get it full screen, we will be set to roll here. From beginning. Okay, and this is a pretty short presentation. I actually attempted to grow cut flowers for the farmer's market when I was doing the heirloom tomatoes, because I figured I have all these flowers, I need more to sell. Let's see what else I can bring from my garden. And it was amazingly challenging. There's some things to know about cut flowers that are different from just raising flowers. So we'll walk through these, and I've actually picked kind of my top 10 recommended for beginners when you're maybe going to do bouquets just for family or friends, or if you're starting out, maybe looking at this as something you'd want to do to earn money with, what flowers are kind of your easy, no fail, and everyone likes them. So I think number one, the easiest to grow, makes the biggest bouquets, and they come in so many colors they can be a single flower bouquet, is probably your zinnias. And of course, these are going to kind of be later season. Zinnias don't get up and going until it's pretty warm. So this is going to be July, August, and September for their peak time. They are very common. So most people that do cut flowers, zinnias are a core feature of their cut flower program. So zinnias come, generally the one that you see being done as cut flowers at the farmer's market are Ben Aries Giant, dahlia flowered. So they're called dahlia flower because they look more like a dahlia. They're very full. Dahlias actually, I think, are somewhere on the list themselves as being a great cut flower. They also have some different varieties. They have some cactus ones that have kind of little quilly petals, some bicolored ones, and they even have a green one that's really popular. And now they have some that are like green with a hint of rose or a hint of another color on there. So zinnias, you're wanting to have nice long stems on your zinnias. So you want them to grow up, but you don't want them to be too over finished. So you want them to come fully out of bud, but you don't want to cut too early. And then you want to cut way down on the plant and then remove any of the leaves that are potentially going to be underwater when you put them in a vase. But otherwise, that's about all the prep and the challenge that a zinnia will give you. They usually recommend for most cut flowers is that you're cutting them and then instantly placing them in at least lukewarm water. So that lukewarm water will make them rehydrate real fast, and then keeping that water changed out through the life of your bouquet to keep the flowers fresh. And they have all sorts of additives you can put in. Everyone kind of swears on a different thing. They have little powder packets that are usually a combination of sugar and bleach. So you're trying to feed the plants with the sugar and the bleach is to try to keep the bacteria down. So usually just changing out your water is plenty to keep them going. So number two is probably sunflowers. Sunflowers grow really well, everyone's favorite. Number one thing you have to know about sunflowers is there are pollen varieties and pollen-less varieties. And almost all the ones that you're going to want to use for cut flowers should be pollenless. You have no idea how much pollen a sunflower creates until you try to bring it inside, and it will leave a big yellow pile of pollen on any tablecloth you put it on. So your standard sunflowers are great for pollinators and bees because they produce a lot of pollen. Not so good for your household if you've got that moving around. So they actually make pollenless single-headed varieties of sunflowers. So that means one plant with one giant head. And these are generally what you're going to find at the farmer's market. And they have, probably 15 different color variations, from light yellow to dark yellow. And they'll have a yellow center, a green center, or a brown center. And they've actually got these timed like within the hour. Like this is a 62-day sunflower, and this is a 64-day sunflower. And the few times I've tried, they are spot on, and I don't know how they adjust that all for climate, but you put that seed in the ground, and 62 days you have a sunflower ready to harvest. So kind of fun. Usually the ones we're growing in our garden are multi-branching, where you're getting a lot of sunflowers off of one plant. There are a few pollenless varieties of multi-branching sunflowers, so in case you're wanting to bring them in for bouquets. They also have all these fun bicolored ones now that you can use, and they have bicolor pollenless ones available now as well. So I think sunflowers is probably definitely the number two pick if you're starting out in cut flowers. I convinced my husband to let me put sunflowers down one of his corn rows when I was doing the farmer's market. And once I said these are like 62-day sunflowers, so they're all going to come in at once if you plant them all at once. So I had 70 sunflowers, and they're usually sold in bunches of like 5. Problem is there's like 3 other people at the farmer's market that has sunflowers, and everyone's used to buying from them. And so I get to market with my one chance at sunflowers, and for some reason, the other 3 people didn't have sunflowers that week, and I sold them all. I was so excited. Sometimes you get lucky, right? Okay, and this one, I wrote this before Jan was able to interject, but gladiolus is probably one of the easiest to grow and fun bulbs for flowers. So gladiolus, you would grow them from a corm. And if you remember, we saw those corms when we were working on our thing. Just a second, my computer is saying that I am going to die if I don't plug in. So that's probably an important part of the process here. Oh, my toe had hit the turn the power thing off. So okay, we're back in business. Grown from a corm, so we got to see what those little corms look like. They aren't hardy from year to year, so they must be pulled. And we, if you want the opportunity to learn how to pull them out of the ground, I'm sure Jan would invite you over this fall. She usually holds a big party to get hers pulled up and replanted. And they come in different sizes, so you can get cute little miniature gladiolas, and you can get giant 4-foot tall gladiolas. And these are another one that they've kind of, if you're not growing a mix, if you buy by variety, they have a pretty good count on how many days it's going to take for that flower to be in. And gladiolas last a very long time in the vase. So you usually want to pick them when the first couple of flowers are starting to pop open, and then they will continue to pop open in the vase until you go down to the bottom. So yeah, gladiolus is a fun one. Dahlia, as I said, I thought dahlias were on here. We grow these from tubers. If you remember seeing that, it's kind of the ugliest tuber thing for a beautiful flower. And you're wanting to look for little eyes on the tubers are going to be new stems. And your old tuber is kind of going to be a shrunk up, shriveled thing. So these have to be pulled every year as well. They won't make it in the ground over the winter. But they have such beautiful forms. So they have these, some of them they call dinner plate dahlias, or the size of dinner plates. But you can also get some smaller ones that just have perfect little petals and forms. And these last very, very well in the vase as well. We got to tour once. Kirk Redlin in Fruitland does dahlias. And he was so sad to see them go in the fall that he actually built giant hoop houses so he can have a couple more weeks of dahlias. And he sells in kind of he puts all the vases up by the road, and it's kind of a honor system, pay as you go. But I try to stop in the fall and get dahlias from him. So Cosmos, this is a great bee-friendly plant and a really easy one to grow for cut flowers. One of the challenges is that once these are pollinated, they like to go to seed really quickly. So if you're using them for cut flowers, you kind of have to be on it and get to them before the bees get to them. But they have all sorts of different colors. They have these cool cupcake ones that look like they're in a cupcake liner. I haven't tried those yet, but they're on my list. Got a picture of some of the orange and yellow family, but you can get them in pink and white and cranberry colored. And they make a fun bouquet just on their own, but they're also a really good filler flower for if you're doing zinnias or dahlias or glads and need something to balance those out with. Snapdragons. Snapdragons are huge in the cut flower business. The challenge is if you buy snapdragons at your local nursery, as those are generally dwarf varieties. Snapdragons in their original form are about 3.5 to 4 feet tall. So most of the little snapdragons you're getting from the nursery, get 12 inches, 18 inches tall if you're lucky. So you need to buy these from seed or transplant to get the full flora size snapdragons. Another challenge with snapdragons is they're very sensitive to the sun. So all those flowers are facing the sun. So if your stem starts to lean, all your flowers start to lean with it. So they often grow these in netting or on a grid just to keep them straight. Because if they lean over with, wind or rain or something, like a dog runs through the bed and pushes them over, they'll grow along the ground and all the flowers will grow up. So the flowers keep going for the sun, but the stems get all wonky. So these are actually really easy from seed, and you can also get them as whole flats to transplant. But snapdragons come in all these pretty colors. Asiatic lilies, and I don't know if later on, I should remember my own presentation, haven't gotten this one for a while, if, what's the other one? Asiatic and Oriental. Oriental lilies are both used for cut flowers. They, once again, can have quite a bit of pollen on them, so sometimes people will cut off the pollen-producing anthers when they use them for cut flowers. I think it makes them look less like a lily when you do that. I just deal with the pollen. But they come in all sorts of different colors. And once again, we got to see what that little bulb looks like. And fairly well timed with these is you can put them in the ground, and if you're using a certain variety, there's usually a certain amount of time that it is to flowering. So usually if you plant, so I've planted mixes of Asiatic lilies in my flower beds, and the yellow ones will come up and bloom, and then the orange ones come and bloom, and the white ones. So they're by variety. They definitely have their own time schedule there. Really popular now is kind of the ones that have black centers or black speckling on them. Lavender. So lavender is a wonderful plant for our area. It's actually pretty drought tolerant. There are some varieties of lavender that are not cold hardy here, so you do have to watch that you're getting something that's zone 5. And if you're in the center of Boise, you can probably get away with zone 6. But some of the varieties are like zone 7, zone 8 plants and won't last the winter here. But a wonderful perennial, so you're growing year after year. Usually the varieties that you're using for cut flowers come from transplant and not from seed. Trying to grow lavender from seed is a huge challenge. They're kind of slow to mature, and you have to be super, super good with your watering, because if you overwater a lavender seedling, it dies. They're pretty picky about not being overwatered. So I've tried them from seed once or twice and not been successful. So buying them as a seedling is probably a better deal. But they come in lots of different color and fragrances, and sometimes they're leaf color. You know, I usually picture lavender with kind of the silvery gray leaves, but they have some varieties now that are more of a brighter green. Wonderful as a dried flower and as a cut flower. Delphiniums. Delphiniums actually do really well. They're a little sensitive to the wind. They can be a really, really tall flower, and so putting them in a protected spot. They usually are coming in these blues, purples, pinks, white as their general colors. Usually you can they usually are blooming in June. If you cut down those flower stalks, as for cut flowers, you'll usually get a re-bloom in the fall from them, especially if you do a little fertilization. These actually grow pretty easy from seed. I have done delphinium from seed, or you can get transplants. And there's kind of 2 types. So the left one is the more structured, traditional delphinium. And then the right is either larkspur, which is an annual delphinium, or a belladonna delphinium. So that's where the flower clusters are not so tight together, but they come in kind of that same range of colors. And for like a country informal bouquet, I kind of like the right-hand side, the larkspur, belladonna ones. But for more formal bouquets, of course, you can't beat those tall spires of fancy flowers. So roses. Roses that are grown to be given to a florist to do arrangement with, they're kind of a whole different ball game than the roses that are in our gardens. And it took me a little bit to figure this out. But there's lots of different kinds of roses. Almost all of them are perennial, unless you get one that's not hardy in our area. Usually the ones that are going to a florist are a hybrid tea rose that have been especially pruned and trimmed to be long-stemmed. So if you think of your roses out in your garden, you can get a stem that's 5-6 inches long on a good day, right? You usually are not getting for a long, tall vase. Some of the old-fashioned roses just don't hold together very well when you bring them inside. The the bloom blasts open and all your petals start to fall off in pretty quick succession. So usually when you're looking, if you're going to buy a rose just so you can bring those roses inside, you'll want to look for one that specifically says good for cut flowers. So I like ordering from David Austin. I have a few English roses, and he's actually taken a few of those and said, okay, these are good for cutting. Your Floribunda and your grandiflora roses generally are not good cut flowers because it's a spray of blooms, and that whole spray usually doesn't come at the same time or is blooming at the same time. So you always have one or two dead ones on there, which out in the garden is wonderful. You always have a flower that's going, but inside it's a little bit challenging. So when you're looking for roses, you want to look for one that specifically says cut flowers if that's what your plan for that rose is. Okay. So that's my top 10 on growing cut flowers. As I said, I've given this a try, and I actually didn't do too bad. Most of my little bouquets sold, and if they didn't sell, it was always fun to give them away. I usually would take them out of their containers and hand them out to somebody. So it was a good present at the end of market, if nothing else. So I will stick around for a bit here. We're actually at 6:26, so going right on time today. And if you have any questions for me, next week I will be presenting from Moscow, Idaho, and I'm working on figuring out what topic I'm doing there. And the week following, I'll be presenting from Washington, D.C. So you'll have different hotel room backgrounds instead of my messy sewing room for the next couple weeks. Okay, thank you, everybody.